Hello, I'm Joseph, and today I want to talk about the Anycubic Kobra Go. This is going to be a review, but it's going to be kind of like a heavy one-sided review. But I want to give some saving grace moments for this, some good points. Um, the features on this printer outmatches the Ender 3 and the Kangaroo KP3 or whatever. The bed size, the feature sets, the print quality are all there for this printer. It's phenomenal in that you get a really good value out of this printer for an as-is solution. As long as you don't want to add anything else other than maybe a filament runout sensor, you're gold, you're set. You don't need to do anything else. But unfortunately, that's kind of where the good parts end. There's a couple bits that stand out that make this really difficult to recommend for someone just getting into 3D printing. In fact, the Neo that this comes with is a better buy because then it also comes with a direct drive, another thing you would normally do as a change to like an Ender 3 printer. It just gets you so close to not needing to make changes, but there's a couple of points that stand out that make it incredibly difficult to customize this to do certain things, and also incredibly difficult to get right the very first time. The first thing I'll talk about is the bed. So you do get a metal PEI spring sheet board. This is great. I love this bed, but there's a couple issues that this is not specific to this bed, but just the setup for the bed. So the Z limiter is fixed. The probe requires a metal bed, and the bushings underneath are also plastic. There are least bushings, so the bed is fixed. You don't have any springs or wheels to deal with. In terms of like a first user experience, it's dead easy to get right and really hard to get wrong. But this bed is not always leveled. At this price point, you can expect unleveled beds. And so what's going to happen is you're probably going to be able to print on maybe like 2/3 of this bed. But if you're going to be pushing out to the outer rims, to the actual printable spots that they tell you can print at, you're going to have too many issues. You're going to have so many issues that you're going to have to do physical changes. So my recommendation is if you're going to get this printer, also get some Kapton tape. This is like this blue tape for thermal stuff. It's super thin, and you can start to tape the areas that this bed just cannot adjust to. This is why some of the Ender beds with automatic bed leveling still come with the wheels, and that's simply because you just can't. It's really difficult to get it right with these beds, and you need some way to manually change this bed. Makes matter worse, this LCD, while super great and really easy to get the stuff like changing down nozzle temps, Z offset, the flow rates, the fans, like it's all right there. I love it. It's incredibly stripped down and simplified. Because they've customized this, you don't have those options that you would expect to do something like manually editing them a mesh point. So even if you did those tapes, this tape stuff, this Kapton tape, and you're still having issues on a particular point of the bed, because it is a 25-point bed. Unfortunately, you're going to be sorely out of luck on getting that to work unless you connect this to a computer and start running these custom Marlin commands, which you will probably want to not want to do. It's just going to take too much time to even bother to do. So the bed is great. The bed leveling system can be great, but don't expect to use this whole bed out of the box, not without some manual changes, either through the software side, or connect it to a computer, or do something with Kapton tape to trying to fix the bed level points where the probe just is not accurate enough as it needs to be to get this bed to be leveled as is. The LCD, like I said, is really simple to work with. I like how everything's up front, but it has some really just stupid stuff. For example, you can't extrude filament out of here at a specific anything. If you only want to extrude 100 millimeters out of here, there's no extruder option in the axis changes. You can move like the bed and the Z height or the Z axis and the gantry and stuff, but you can't extrude any filament. You have to use their load and unload. The problem with that is it throws the temp up to like 230 degrees, which is sometimes too hot for some of this filament, and then it unloads, but it never stops. It's an infinite thing. You have to know to press the nozzle in order to stop it. And then when you press it, it still goes for a little bit and then you're done. But if you walk away and you actually forget about it, you could be spilling out so much filament on that. I don't know why they chose that. And there's no way in the configurations options or even EEPROM settings to change that 230 degrees. You can't even recompile the firmware without changing 230 degrees in like 5 or 6 different spots because it's all hard-coded in this menu. This LCD is a big point as to why I'd say this is great as is, because fine, if you don't need to do any of those things, this is kind of more advanced stuff you would do for a printer anyways, then it doesn't matter. But if you wanted to compile newer versions of Marlin, if you want to get new features added to this printer that's already available through the source code, you can't, because this LCD depends on it being programmed against those Marlin features. Mesh edit point is one of those. If you enable that or you enable UBL, you're going to get all these compiling errors because they just wasn't designed. This firmware wasn't designed to work with those feature sets, and the LCD specifically won't be able to have the menus to interact with those feature sets either. So you'll be enabling those features and maybe disabling some LCD stuff just so you can send custom commands. I don't know. It's just dumb. It's dumb that they went that route. I understand why they did that. They want to have it to look different than an Ender 3. But this LCD is not the answer. It cuts off a lot of the community efforts that you could do and then enable on this printer if it was just more easier to work with in that regard. The print head. So let me just put this silicone stock back on. This print head here is what you see in this printer. I hate it with a passion. And this could just be my personal preference, but there's a single point of contact here. Here, let me take this off actually. There's a single point of contact, which makes servicing this kind of a pain in the ass. Now, I'm used to this type of single point of contact because I do have all metal hot ends, but I don't need to service this very often as an all metal hot end. As this, coupled with the Bowden tube, you're going to get maybe 100 hours of printing, and you need to do something. You need to change the nozzle or change the Bowden tube or something, and you need to work with this. Because it's a single point of contact, and they also put concrete glue in here, like everything. This has concrete glue. This little threaded thing back here has concrete glue. The nozzle has concrete glue. The heat plate has concrete glue. It seems like they don't intend for you to actually change the fucking nozzle on this thing. But regardless, you have to heat this to 240 degrees Celsius. You need to hold the block in place with a pair of pliers. Usually they're metal. I don't know what else they would be. This is going to get hot very fast, so you're going to burn yourself if you don't remove the nozzle quick enough. And then when you remove the nozzle and you put it back in, because this metal is so fucking hot, you could strip the threading on here, or you can put it too loose of a contact. And if you put it too loose of a contact, you're going to have a bunch of filament spilling out, and it's not going to be super obvious. You're probably going to be like mid of a 12-hour print, and then you're going to see groups and blobs keep popping off, or a bunch of more stringing happening. But like, hey, what's going on? And you take this apart and you see that there's a bunch of filament on top and bottom. The threading, the contact between the nozzle and the heat break isn't there to hold the block in place as it should. And it's just a lot of user error that can happen because of this. Just for reference, this is a CR10 nozzle. This is like the J-Head MK8V6 design stuff, or their own custom design. But an Ender type of thing, a CR10, has screws contacting the heater block to this cooling fin system, and then you can just change the nozzle and have everything stay in place. You don't need to hold this block at all. You can just crank it as much as you want or as little, and then if it gets a little loose, you can tighten the screws down here. On top of that, they don't have multiples of these little threads. Normally, you would need to replace the thermistor long before you replace the heater cartridge, and the thermistor is just like an Allen wrench or another screw that you do as well, versus having multiples of these tiny little screws that also like have the concrete glue on it. So I hate this thing. Now, I've replaced it with this, but this is not a drop-in solution. The temperatures for the thermistor are vastly different, and you need to PIT tune it. You can't even do that because it's going to fail. So you need to find the values in like an Ender 3 printer and try to transfer them over and then PID tune. On top of that, the flow rate. So the good thing about this is that this actually has a lot of room to heat the filament. So you can print faster on this over an Ender 3, but when you switch over to this, you need to vastly change the flow rate. You just can't keep up with the print speeds and everything else that this offers, this type of design. It's not necessarily bad in terms of how it prints and how fast it can print, but in terms of maintenance, which is one thing I prefer over print speeds, this is so much easier to maintenance than this would ever be. So yeah, just keep that in mind. There could be to be honest, that'd be one of the reasons why I wouldn't even bother with this printer, is that print head is god awful hard to maintenance, unless you want to buy a new print head for $20 versus changing the nozzle. So I talked about the bed, the LCD, the heater block. That's really it. Everything else is great. It's phenomenal. I love it. But then becomes the part of customizations. Like I said, you can get a filament runout sensor, $15. It supports the board, has a slot for it. It is a little difficult to get to the board. The board has clips at the bottom of it that you have to like push in and stuff, but you could potentially break those clips because those clips are incredibly firm and set in place. But the big thing is why I wouldn't recommend this over an Ender 3 is the software. So this requires Kali, an ARM, proprietary ARM compiler from ARM. So it's a big manufacturer or a big company behind the compiler, but you need to, in order to compile it, like if Anycubic provides open source code for this on a GitHub repository, they just don't give you any information on how to compile it. You need to find some obscure Reddit post for some community member. They give you a license key to start, so you can get your own license key. The license key is only for 1 month. You have to provide your first name, your last name, your phone number, your email address, your date of birth, all the stuff that I personally would not want to give to another company, specifically just to compile some software that they have no idea what I'm compiling anyways. Then on top of that, it's a Windows only solution. This compiler is not available on Linux. It's not available on Mac. It's not available for Windows on ARM. It is an x86 64-bit only. And the compiler that you have to use is a very specific version of the compiler. The latest version of the compiler doesn't work, which then goes into, okay, well, I want to enable linear advance. Well, linear advance is broken on this release of Marlin. They chose to pick out some obscure version of a 2019 bug fix branch release. It's not even a release, it's just some commit point. And then they gut it and stripped out a bunch of stuff and put in their own code. I understand why they gutted the code, because it takes a long time to compile. So if they're doing tweaks and stuff, they don't want to wait a very long time to compile the source code. By gutting it, by ripping out a lot of the code, you can save yourself a lot of compile time. So that's what they did. Unfortunately, that means you can't drop in a new version of Marlin 2.0 because it's not going to compile. There's too many things that they were removing and changing that when you add it back in, even if you merge their changes, still does not work. For Marlin 2.1, if you want input shaping, that's not going to work. Now, the saving grace of that is you can use Klipper, but Klipper is not a standalone solution. Klipper requires an additional computer or single board computer, something like the Raspberry Pi 20 or 02. This is something that you would connect to the USB-C port and put Klipper on here that will run a web interface like I forgot what it's called offhand, like Mieko or something like that. This would run a web interface. You'd go to a computer to go to, like a website that you can go to and load it up, and then you forget about the LCD altogether. There have been some community efforts for the Kobra series LCD, so that means that there's probably some hope to still have that LCD operate in some capacity, but I wouldn't put my bets on it if you were going to switch to Klipper. I will be making a video on that. I'll also be making a video on how to switch out the hot end, because I did switch it out. It's just there's a bunch of stuff you have to change with the flow rates and thermistor values and everything else with that. So basically, like, if you're going to want to buy this so you can make these changes, because it's an almost solution there. Unfortunately, when you go to make these changes, you're going to find out the very hard way that probably wasn't worth the money to spend to make tweaks to this. It's worth the money to spend as is. It's worth the money because you get a fantastic PLA printer. You get an okay PETG printer. If you go with the Neo version, then you get a fantastic PLA, PETG, and TPU printer. In terms of printing ABS, small parts maybe, you can add a shield draft in Cura, or you can just toss this in an enclosure. The only thing I would say is you kind of need to remove the power supply out of there, because that's the component that gets the hottest and will fail or turn off if it gets too hot. So you don't necessarily want that in, specifically if you're pushing the bed temps to 110 degrees and sitting there right underneath the bed. So any cool air that it's going to probably try to breathe in is hot air generated from the bed itself. So it's just nice to move that out of there. And that's definitely possible. They don't have that weird RC car connector. I forgot what it's called, like the Ender 3 has. So you just buy a longer 14 gauge wire, strip it, put it together through another connector if you want, and then have that power supply set outside. But beyond that, it's phenomenal value. It definitely prints well. It just, the only big catch is that you will be needing to possibly make changes to the bed physically with some Kapton tape, and then any points that you can't seem to get, you can either do it through software, which is a very painful part, or use something like a stick of glue. And yes, it's a good printer, just not one to change.